All right, hello humans and or other sentient or conscious forms of life. I hope you're doing all well. As you can see, I've kind of moved my filming environment, so from my bedroom to this unused office space, which hopefully looks nicer. Still some things to shuffle here and there, put some books on the bookshelf. But as you've probably ascertained from the title of this video is a response to the channel Jung to Live By. If you're somebody who's avidly interested in Carl Jung's work, there's a good chance that you've seen this channel or that you're even subscribed to this channel, since they are one of the best resources I've seen on the internet relating to all things Jung. But if you haven't heard of them, they are, like I said, a YouTube channel, which, again, one of the best I've seen on this platform with respect to discussing Jungian psychology, specifically a branch of Jungian psychology, which is called, what is it called? Psychosystems analysis is what it's called. So again, if you haven't encountered this channel and you're interested in Jung, I recommend subscribing right away because they discuss all of the things which I discuss, but in significantly more detail. And plus they have a lot more clinical experience than I do. And so they have actually put Jung's ideas into practice. As opposed to me, who just kind of screams into a camera. Now, speaking from my own experience, this channel has actually been very immensely beneficial to me and has helped illuminate some of the psychological concepts which I was kind of having a hard time wrapping my head around, particularly the concept of the alter ego as this concomitant structure to the shadow, as well as the idea of psychic infection, which has been very illuminating. So I've been personally helped by sort of the videos on this channel. Now, what this response video actually pertains to is the topic of the self archetype, a major concept in Jungian psychology. And the way this concept is conceptualized on Jung to Live By is, in my opinion, and according to my experience, which is admittedly very limited, incorrect. Now, again, it could be that I'm mistaken, that either I'm misinterpreting their conceptualization or that I'm just flat out wrong. But I think I do have a case to make here as to why Jung's concept of the self, as he described, is actually distinct from the way it's conceptualized by Jung to Live by Steve, Pauline, and James. Which again, is still a valid concept in and of itself, but it's not synonymous with Jung's concept of the self. And I want to make it clear what this is. This is a disagreement about a theoretical point, and not necessarily a practical point. And so, even if there is an error here theoretically, it may not change things all that much at a practical level. Even Jung himself said something to the effect of, you can get away with insufficient theory, but you can't get away with insufficient practices. And in this debate, it's more of a philosophical point than anything that actually affects the core theory. Furthermore, I want to make it clear that if there is a mistake here, this isn't a reason to dismiss the channel entirely. I feel like we live in an age where we find out that a person that we admire or a person that we respect has some flaw, and then we just dismiss them entirely. It's basically what cancel culture is, and I think that's unfair. I mean, even this channel, what you're watching right now, I've probably made a fair number of mistakes in my past videos. But I don't think any one mistake is reason to just dismiss everything that I'm saying. And furthermore, I want you guys to always be critical with what I say. Don't just take everything I say on faith. Consult multiple sources. Check out multiple YouTube channels that discuss Jung and sort of see the different perspectives on what's going on there. And if you notice something that's possibly inaccurate or misstated, then let me know so that I can either make the correction or we can kind of figure out where the confusion is coming from. And again, I encourage people to consult multiple sources and consult multiple Jungian YouTube channels. For example, Zevi's channel, Seekers of Unity, which I hope you guys have seen, is an amazing YouTube channel, but he discusses the more mystical aspects of Jung. And personally, I find that super interesting. And I don't think that viewpoint is necessarily invalid just because it's more mystical. It's just another perspective on this topic. One of many possible perspectives. And each perspective has its realm of applicability and validity. And again, Jung to Live By is a channel which I personally recommend. And so the errors or supposed errors that I'm talking about, I could be mistaken, aren't, in my opinion, a good enough reason to dismiss them entirely. The channel is still very valuable. So with that said, let's get into my argument. And this is about the self archetype, something I've discussed a fair amount on this channel. So Jung described the self, like many concepts he described, in various ways, but one of the definitions he used was that the self was the entirety of the psyche, which consists of consciousness and the unconscious, the whole thing, the whole package, so to speak. And a quote from Jung here, which I'll read, is from this volume 9, part 1 of his collected works. I'm not sure if you can see that well on the camera. Yeah, there we go. But I'll read the quote now, is, "I have elected to call it the self, by which I understand a psychic totality, and at the same time a center, neither of which coincides with the ego, but includes it just as a larger circle encloses a smaller one. So again, it's consciousness and the unconscious together. The ego is a part of the self, the unconscious is a part of the self, the collective unconscious is a part of the self, the personal unconscious is a part of the self. The entirety of the psyche is enclosed in this concept. And in a sense, it's just a description of the psyche. You know, we don't really have to regard it as a psychic entity in its own right. We can just think of it as Jung describing something which is the entire psyche. And it could, you know, we don't have to take it any further than that. Now, for various reasons, which are due to the fact that Jung entangled this concept with his own personal myth, the people at Jung to Live By claimed that the self is better described as the genomic self. Now, I actually recommend you watch their videos on this topic to actually understand what the genomic self is and what it covers. But if I were to summarize it, it is essentially who you are at a fundamental genetic level. Essentially, a good portion of your psychic makeup is predetermined by your genetic, your genetic predispositions. Who you are at the level of the genome, determined before you're even born. And we can think of these as like the core instincts, the core innate instincts, which again exist a priori. But this concept also includes, anything in your psyche which is predetermined. So if you're genetically predisposed to certain mental conditions, that would technically fall under the scope of the genomic self. But the core of the genetic self, insofar as we're discussing Jungian theory, are that the fact that the archetypes themselves arise from this genomic self. And you're pre-equipped with certain ways of viewing the world and certain ways with interacting with the people you encounter when you're born. And this kind of shapes your psychic development. So the first kind of projection are obviously onto the parental figures, and your psyche is pre-equipped to kind of deal with your parental figures and then with the various stages of life thereafter. And so this is the first point that I want to disagree with. And it's not that the notion of the genomic self is in itself incorrect. It's very much a real thing and very much an apt description of a real thing, but it's not the same as Carl Jung's notion of the self. Because Carl Jung's notion of the self embraces all those psychic contents which weren't genetically acquired and aren't a result of your genome. And so again, you could think of the genomic self as being contained within Jung's concept of the self. And there are many examples of contents which are within the scope of your psyche and so are a part of yourself and yet aren't given to you by your inherent genetic makeup. I'll just use one example. Would be like, for example, somebody who experienced some sort of trauma in their early childhood, or something like, for example, if your mother died in childbirth while they were giving birth to you, and you grow up without like a suitable mother figure, that's going to affect you down the line. That's going to have a significant effect on your psychological development, and you will bear the psychological marks of that event. And yet nothing about your genome is different. You still have the same genetic structure. Whether or not your mom survives, your genome is fundamentally the same. And yet some event in your life, which again is a result of the environment, has shaped your psyche in an important way. And I guess the main point here is that the fact that it's not just your genome which determines your psyche, it's also the environment, the genome interacting with the environment, which produces a significant portion of your psyche. It's not just your genome that determines the organism, it's the genome environment interaction, that interface which actually gives rise to the structure of the organism. And you can probably imagine a lot of other examples of things which, experiences which happen to you in your life, which don't affect your genes, and yet are still in your psyche and still shape your psyche. But the ones I want to focus on, because they're kind of relevant for what I'm going to talk about later on, are consciousness and morality. Now, your genome might prepare you for the concept of morality. You may have a genomic structure which prepares you for the possibility that you'll encounter a moral structure in your life. That's not fully established, but it's possible. But it's not as if your genome is pre-equipped with the actual character of that morality. Your morality and what you believe morally is shaped by societal factors and, your environment, aka your parents, and what they impose upon you. And your genome knows nothing about this other than the fact that it anticipates some form of morality. So for example, if you believe that premarital sex is wrong, that is a moral belief which you hold, it's contained within your psyche since it's something you believe. It's within your mind. And it acts as a constraining force on your impulses. So again, that's why I can confidently say that's a part of your psyche, because just having this belief in your head changes your behavior. But at the same time, your genome, through your instincts, is still acting and telling you something rather different, because your instincts can't tell the difference between married or unmarried. Only your conscious discriminating mind can make that distinction. Your genome, on the other hand, doesn't really care if the person is married or unmarried. It just wants to reproduce and perpetuate its genes. And so that whole idea of premarital sex is just completely a construct within your mind, a moral belief, but again, your genome has nothing to do with it. Now, there's an interesting thought experiment we could think about to kind of wrap your head around this, which I found kind of cool. So just imagine if we cloned a person, and I'll just say like from like sub-Saharan Africa. Let's just say we cloned a baby from sub-Saharan Africa so that there were two of them. And we placed one of the clones in downtown Tokyo or something, and another like in a primitive hunter-gatherer tribe in South America. So these two clones will have identical DNA. So genomically, there's nothing different about them. Genetically, they're the same individual. And yet 30 years later, when we compare them, we're going to find something completely different in both of them. The person who was raised in Tokyo will have learned a very particular set of moral beliefs, a very particular perspective of seeing the world. So his consciousness is different, how he understands the world is different, and he will also have a completely different language. And that's another important thing, is that our minds anticipate the possibility of there being language, so we can acquire language, but the actual character of that language is something which is given to us by our environment, by your parents, and by your education. And so the words you learn and the concepts your mind kind of crystallizes around are, again, part of your psyche and shape how you see the world and are not determined genetically. And so obviously this person the clone who's raised amongst primitive hunter-gatherers will see the world in a completely different way. He'll have a completely different language. His moral beliefs will be completely different, presumably less rigid than what you would get in Tokyo. And so in a sense, his self is different. So there's two different selves, genomically the same self, and yet, this is how we can make a distinction between the self as Jung originally described it and the genomic self. So like even the structure of your consciousness is a part of yourself and is yet something which is, and it's probably influenced by the genome to a degree, but again, your consciousness consists of all of the ideas of which you're conscious of, and so again, is something acquired by the environment, acquired by your education. So if you go to school versus if you don't go to school, your consciousness will be different because you'll have been conscious of different things. So let me use my dog as an example. So this is Teddy. You may have seen him before. He's wearing this cone because he recently had surgery. He's not very photogenic. He doesn't look very great on camera. But I'll use him as an example. So Teddy is, he's a sentient organism, but I wouldn't necessarily consider his breadth of consciousness to be at the same extent as me. Oh, Teddy. Because Teddy is not conscious of the fact that he has internal organs. He has no idea that he has a brain. He has no idea that he has a digestive system or a heart that's pumping blood. He's not conscious of any of those things at all. But I do know this stuff because I was taught in school. My schooling illuminated certain aspects of existence. He's very wicky, very loving dog. But again, my schooling illuminated parts of existence that now I'm aware of, which then later in life influence how I see the world. Even something like our understanding of genetics. I'm going to put him down now because he's licking my hand to death. Oh, I'm sorry, buddy. So even our consciousness of something like genetics, the fact that we understand how genetic codes give rise to fully fledged biological organisms, consists of psychic contents. Our minds essentially created the model of DNA. And of course, that model corresponds with reality, so it's a good model. But again, our minds created it. And again, this model illuminates things about the natural world. And again, it's not as if our genomes told us about genetics. We had to learn that through experimentation with the external environment. And so we've gained something, again, which isn't contained in our genome, but is contained in our psyche. Now, your morality and your consciousness are actually a very significant part of yourself, since your morality informs the way you behave very extremely. Your genome, if you walk into a grocery store, your genome might be telling you to just eat whatever you see, but of course, morally, you have to pay for what you buy. And so your moral beliefs do influence your behavior to an astonishing degree. And I understand why it's important to emphasize the biological aspects of psychology, because they are very important. And again, I'm not saying the genomic self isn't a thing. It's definitely a thing. It's just that we also have to take account for the aspects of the psyche which aren't accounted for simply by biology. Now, the reason why Jung to live by, at least as far as I understand it, I could be misinterpreting, but the reason that they've replaced the concept of the self with the genomic self is that the idea of the self as Jung originally conceived of it was highly value-laden with Jung's own personal myth. And so in effect is a projection of his own personal circumstances and is unreflective of anything objective because it came from his kind of own personal experiences, which he just kind of assumed was an objective truth. This is particularly evident when Jung describes various religious symbols and ideas as being symbolic of the self archetype. In particular, he refers to the monotheistic God as being a symbol of the self, and also Jesus, the primary figure of Christianity. So in essence, because one of Carl Jung's aims, according to the Jung to Live by team, was to reconcile science and religion, which is which is fairly obvious if you read Jung well enough that that's definitely what he's trying to accomplish. Jung was raised a Christian, and he did take it very seriously as a young boy, and so it would have conflicted with his later sort of scientific rational attitude of the kind of zeitgeist in which he lived. And his whole notion of the self-archetype then seems to appear to be some kind of reconciliation between science and religion, and an attempt to give kind of scientific validity to Christianity. Now, like the notion of the genome itself, I don't think this is necessarily wrong. I think it does describe Jung's situation. Jung's personal myth obviously did, influence the trajectory of his work. But that doesn't mean that the conclusions he came to are automatically invalid. He may have been motivated by his internal struggle, but I think the conclusions he came to are sound and well justified. The monotheistic God does represent the self-archetype, and if you see my video on the self-archetype, you'll see exactly why. It's because it's complicated, but we have to think of God as a psychological phenomenon. We have to forget about whether God actually exists out there. But again, the human mind conceptualizes something like God. And of course, God is very different from the ego. You don't perceive yourself as God. You perceive your God as something external, something superordinate to you. And so it's if we think about it psychologically, it must be pointing to deeper aspects of the psyche. It must be, especially the monotheistic God being the kind of all-encompassing God, it must be pointing to something which isn't the ego and yet is deeper in the unconscious. And in fact, as Jung aptly explains, Jesus does really represent this self-archetype. The fact that we have this kind of moral inclination while also this instinctual inclination, and the fact that these two things often fight. Anybody who reads the story of Jesus critically realizes that this is what this story is fundamentally about. The fact that we're natural beings put on this unnatural trajectory and the kind of conflicts that arise therein. But of course, just because, Jesus does illuminate this archetype, it doesn't mean that we should all convert to Christianity. I think that's besides the point. It just means that the myth of Christ stems from the psychological archetype of the self. And if you think about it, Jesus does represent very much the clash between our earthly instinctual selves and our higher moral principles. The video I made about Jesus on the self isn't based on Ion at all. It's completely independent of Ion, and I discuss the symbolism within the Christian myth and why this symbolism represents the self-archetype. And again, one of the very interesting things about this is the fact that it explains why people revere Jesus for so long. It's because they can see their own psychological situations depicted in the figure of Christ. And another point I wanted to make is that the figure of Jesus doesn't just have personal significance for Jung. There are billions of people, living and dead, who were shaped significantly by some guy who lived in the desert of Galilee 2,000 years ago. So this isn't merely a personal thing for Jung in attempting to understand the symbolism of Christianity. It's actually of very significant historical interest to dissect said symbolism and understand its effects on the human mind. And again, Jung's conclusion from all of this isn't that you need to be Christian. He more or less just explains why Christianity was able to grip the minds of people to such an extent and the further implications of that. It is a very interesting thing. Why was this desert guy able to shape history so completely? Well, part of the answer is this psychological view where Jesus depicts the archetype, and insofar as he depicts the archetype, it depicts people's internal psychological situation, which seemingly lends the Christ figure the supernatural significance, whether that supernatural significance is there or not. And just to clarify this point even more, he didn't really have to pick Jesus to pick on. That's just the important symbol in the Western canon. He could have picked any number of religious icons who also depict the self-archetype. He could have picked Horus from Egyptian mythology. He could have picked Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha. There are a lot of parallels between Buddha and Jesus, especially Buddha's when he was fasting by the tree and he was approached by this demon, very similar to when Jesus encounters Satan in the desert. He could have picked Krishna from Hinduism, who parallels Christ in a number of ways, and again is a very revered symbol in Hinduism. And in that sense, Jesus isn't unique at all. What makes him unique is the fact that he happened to be the guy who did influence the West that much. If Manichaeism became the dominant religion in the West, we would have a symbol of Mani in the West, and Ion would have been written instead from attempting to understand the symbolism of Manichaeism. In fact, he didn't even have to pick a religious figure at all. I could write a book explaining why Harry Potter is a symbol of the self. And the only difference is that Harry Potter isn't the central figure of the world's most popular religion. Although there are many people who treat Harry Potter as if he's a religious figure. If you've ever, encountered the Harry Potter fandoms, it's almost like they're religiously fanatic about Harry Potter. Well, why? It's because Harry Potter embodies this self-archetype, and in doing so, he's able to grip the minds of the people who admire him. And there are many ways in which Harry Potter does depict this archetype, but again, in that sense, Christ isn't that unique. He just happens to be the guy who people took way more seriously. I think there is like a general desire to dismiss ideas if they have a religious connotation, because it then seems like we're legitimizing religion. But again, just examining the psychological symbolism found in religion is not in itself inherently an endorsement of religion. It's just saying, this is why we develop these symbols, this is what they mean, this is why people revere them, and that's of course a very important historical development. Anybody who studied the history of religion should realize how big of a problem this is. We've been religious for something like 40,000 years, possibly even 70,000 years. Why did this talking ape randomly decide to invent gods? What's that all about? It's important to dig into that and, not just be bound by our present day, which is relatively secular. So just because Jesus embodies the self archetype doesn't automatically make Jesus divine. It's just a symbol. And the symbol just explains something about our reality, which is profound, sure, but again, it's just poetry, more or less. It's no different if I analyzed any work of fiction. And again, the Jesus's influence on the West is very deep, and so there is precedent for exploring this. And this work can be seen as highly relevant to Christian people who have experienced a lapse of faith, and this is affecting them psychologically. A work like Aeon it does kind of, add more significance to the myth of Christ, even if Christ himself wasn't a divine figure. And so in that sense, it can have therapeutic value, although albeit fairly limited. So just because something has a mystical cloak about it doesn't make it an endorsement of mysticism. And furthermore, the psyche is a strange thing. It doesn't always obey rational rules. Religion is a good evidence of that. Why did we invent this very irrational thing, religion? It's because the psyche in and of itself isn't attuned to rationality. Rationality is a fairly new concept, but the psyche doesn't think in that way. It doesn't automatically think in an inherently rational way. In fact, there's good reason to think that irrational ways of thinking are better for perpetuating our genes. In some cases, it's a that debatable point. Okay, anyways, I hope that explains my perspective and why I think that there is an error in Jung to live by. Again, I could be wrong. It could be mistaken. I could have misinterpreted their work. I did try my best to watch their videos and watch them several times to make sure that I had it right. And I've invited them to discuss this with me in conversation. I hope they take up the invitation because it would be fun to debate this. And I feel like we'd both learn a lot. But yeah, like I said, it's an incredible channel. I'm going to continue to watch it because of how helpful it's been. And I hope you subscribe to it as well, especially if you're interested in Jungian psychology. But anyways, yeah, hope you have a great day and that good luck comes your way. Take care.